This Cobra CPI2575 does seem to be able to handle a full load, and full load I'm going to qualify because that's about 1500 watts, not 2500 as advertised, without overheating. It handles that just fine. So next I'm going to take a look at the accuracy of this meter. Now, I have two of these units. One of them, the meter is not as accurate as the other. This is the more accurate one, so it's very difficult to say how accurate it really is. I'm just going to measure the accuracy of this one. Now, this is a standard household kilowatt meter. It's not a piece of scientific equipment, and it's not perfectly accurate, but I know it is fairly accurate based on measuring in a few different ways. So I'm going to use that. Now, I have this heater here. I'm just going to turn this on. We'll measure a resistive load to start with and see how accurate that is. Now, this is saying, I'll wait for the heater to warm up. So we're looking at about 830 watts. This says 870. I'll turn it on high. And now it is saying 1.5 kilowatts when really we're about 1.35 kilowatts. So this is a little bit optimistic. And if I turn on another load, let's see what it does, because that's going to put us over what this inverter can really do. I'll turn on another heater on low. That should be about 600 watts more, assuming the voltage doesn't droop, but I know it will. And just to demonstrate that, we're at 116 volts right now, which is very good. I'll turn this heater on low. And now it is complaining, and the voltage has drooped very significantly to 111 volts. And the total wattage draw is only 1,730 watts and falling. And just to demonstrate once again that we have adequate input voltage, remember this is measured at the input terminals themselves, it is 11.5 volts. More than adequate for this inverter. But this inverter, which is labeled as 2500 watts, once again, it can't do it. This is a 1500 watt inverter, and the manufacturer is outright lying to their customers. Now here's another thing that I don't like. This is the error message that the inverter is giving you. And do you want to know why it's saying low voltage protection? That's because if you call in, they can just tell you that your input cables aren't adequate. I've verified that my input cables are adequate for this in terms of voltage drop at least. They may overheat in time, but that's not the issue here. The voltage drop is perfectly adequate. They say it should operate down to 10 volts, but this is at 11.5 and it was saying low voltage protection. So this is saying low voltage so that when you call in and say that my inverter isn't working, they can blame you instead of blaming themselves. Because it is their fault, it is not yours. And that's very disheartening for me to see that. I have lost a lot of respect for the Cobra brand. The CPI2550 that I had reviewed earlier, about a year ago, that one was mediocre. And I said that it wasn't great, but it was worth what I paid for. Now, I had reviewed a Whistler inverter a little bit earlier, and I thought that that was one of the worst inverters that I'd ever seen. And really, I think it's still worse than this one. But let's do a few more tests to see what this can really power, because these are somewhat theoretical tests, and they are just resistive loads. They're not active loads, not the sort of loads that people would really want to power. But let's test a few of those before I draw a final conclusion on this product. Here's the box that the inverter came in, and a lot of times I get the comment that, well, this inverter is used by truck drivers. They're some of the most abusive users on the market. Well, no, they're really not, because truck drivers really don't use inverters to their full capability. They're very easy users and very consumer-oriented, meaning you can tell them anything and they'll believe it. And I'm not here to insult truck drivers. That's not it at all. It's just that their business is not understanding inverters or electronics. It's driving a truck and managing that business. And I'm sure they do a great job at it, but trucks really have terrible batteries. They are awful, awful batteries. Very similar to automotive. They have shorter warranties because they know that truck drivers abuse them. Not because it's their fault, it's just the nature of the business. And really, a truck alternator can only output maybe 1500 watts, and that's about it. So really you can't draw a whole lot of power out of a product like this continuously without overheating something. And usually all you're doing is maybe powering a coffee pot or a refrigerator or something for a short period of time. And really that's a pretty easy load to power. Now a real difficult load for an inverter is something like what a contractor would want to run. Let's say that a contractor doesn't want to have a generator. I don't know why, but let's just say that they don't. And they want to use an inverter for that application. So instead of going out and buying that $2,500 Honda generator, they go out and buy an inverter like this. And they want to run their air compressor, a circular saw, maybe a drill, that sort of thing. And that's what's really going to stress something like this. So let me do a few different tests with this inverter. First of all, I'm going to use this Cobra inverter to see if it will run my full-size refrigerator. Now I have a 600 watt inverter that runs my refrigerator just fine. That's a Xantrex 600 watt X-Power inverter. I've also tried a 1600 watt Whistler inverter, and it was fully incapable of running my refrigerator. That's pretty pathetic. Let's see what this Cobra inverter can do. I certainly hope that this will be able to power it. It is a 2500 watt inverter with a 5000 watt peak after all. And you know what my refrigerator uses? Well, off of sine wave power, it only takes 120 watts. Here's my refrigerator, a pretty standard full-size refrigerator. And I have a few light bulbs going over here just so we can see how much the voltage sags when the refrigerator starts up. It is a little under 300 watts. I'm going to plug my refrigerator in and see if it can run it or if it complains. Sometimes inverters don't like heavily inductive loads like induction motors, PSC motors like refrigerators have, so let's see what this does with it. Hopefully it starts it right up. And we'll see how much these lights sag over here in the background when I plug it in. If I can get this cord to plug in. Prongs are a little bent. Okay, try again. I think they'll go in now. And the refrigerator did start up. It wasn't a major problem. So that's good. I'm going to turn out these light bulbs now. And let's see how much power this refrigerator uses off of modified sine wave. I'd mentioned that on pure sine it uses about 120 watts. But you can see that on modified sine it uses significantly more. This will drop very slowly over time, but it looks like it's going to stabilize at maybe 170 watts or so, which is a significant increase. And that's not really characteristic of this inverter itself. That's just modified sine wave inverters in general. If you want to run appliances efficiently, you need pure sine. Now this one may advertise 85 to 90% efficient, but realistically a 70% efficient pure sine inverter will use less battery power to run your refrigerator. It's just the nature of the game. But it does power my refrigerator. Let's try something else. Alright, let's say that you're a contractor and you have a 500 watt halogen light and a circular saw and you want to run those. So here I have about 500 watts of incandescent light going, and on the floor over here, just as a demonstration, I have my 13 amp circular saw. And I'm going to see what happens when I power this up. And let's see how much the lights dim, or if it even powers it. And it does seem to run it alright. These motors are universal motors in general, with brushes, and they'll run perfectly fine off of a modified sine wave, not a problem. The only issue is if they have a variable speed trigger, with which of course saws never do, then they won't run properly. But it does seem to run this saw alright. I'm not going to cut something here because I don't want to make a mess upstairs and I don't want to run a long extension cord to the basement, but it does seem to power it just fine. For my next test, I'm going to test two things at once. First, I'm going to see if it can power my air compressor. It is a cast iron reciprocating air compressor, and it is very difficult to start. Earlier I had reviewed a CPI2550, also a 2500 watt inverter from Cobra, and that one is able to power my air compressor. We'll see if this one can. But also, while I'm at it, I'm also going to test the absolute surge capability. Now, I know that this air compressor is going to be taking this inverter to its limits and possibly beyond, so on the input I have this clamp meter, and I have it set to the max hold. So this will hold the maximum amount of current that this inverter is able to draw. And that will be a very good indicator of how many surge watts this inverter is actually able to do. Now, we've established that this Cobra 2500 watt inverter can really only do about 1500 watts, which is pathetic to say the least. But let's see what it can do for surge. It says 5000 watts peak. If you read the manual, it says 3000 watt surge. Those don't even agree, but we'll ignore that for now, because if it can even do 2500 watt surge, I'm going to be impressed. It does look like a 1500 watt inverter inside, and so far it behaves like a 1500 watt inverter. But let's go out to the garage, plug in my air compressor, and see what it can do. Here's the air compressor that I'm going to be powering with the inverter, or at least attempting to. It's only a 5-gallon tank, and it's a pretty cheap compressor, but it does have a 13 amp motor, and it is pretty difficult to start. It has, I forget what it is exactly, 5 or something CFM on it, so it's a pretty large air compressor in terms of the compressor, about as big as you can power from 120 volts. And let's see if this inverter can power it. I'll set the camera down right here. Hopefully you can see what I'm doing. And I will plug in the cord and let's see what happens. All here is a beep, a constant beep. And the inverter is still beeping. Let's run upstairs and see what it's complaining about. And this is what it's complaining about: overload protection. Well, you know what? I didn't overload you, and here's the proof. 192 amps. That's less than 2 kilowatts. Not only can this inverter not do 2500 watts continuous, it can't even do 2000 watts surge. This is a terrible product, absolutely terrible. And I think I'm going to stop testing it here because I don't see any reason to continue testing this. Don't waste your time on this inverter. So, the Cobra CPI2575 inverter, well, what do I even say about it? I mean, it's bad. And I don't mean power glove bad, I mean, it's a terrible product. Now, I've reviewed a lot of inverters, I've looked at a lot, I've repaired a lot, I've used a lot, and I have a lot of experience in working with and the technical aspects of what goes into these. This is a bad product. Now, I don't say that lightly because I respect that there are a lot of design decisions that go into, especially consumer electronics, a lot of trade-offs, a lot of things like that, and there are good things to say about this product. It comes in a shiny case, I guess. Maybe you like the way it looks. It inputs battery power and outputs AC current. I guess that's nice. It will run a few light bulbs in a refrigerator. I guess it should, but it does. It has a power meter on it. Not all of them have that. It has outlets that are pretty decent quality. The case is pretty durable. The quality control really, I think, is pretty good, to be honest. Not all of them are. This one is. But in terms of its performance, I just can't forgive it because they say that this is a 2500 watt inverter. It's not. It's maybe a 1500 watt inverter, and that is it. So it's really unforgivable. This is a bad product. Now, I reviewed a Whistler 1600 watt inverter a little bit earlier, and at the time, that was the worst inverter I had ever seen. Now, this one is pretty much a tie. This one actually does perform better, but you would expect it would. It's a 2500 watt model. The other one was a 1600 watt model. Now, if I had reviewed the Whistler 2500 watt inverter, I might come to a different conclusion on that one. But this is not a good product. I would not recommend it, and I just don't have much good to say about it. If you're going to buy an inverter and you don't want to spend a lot, I would recommend, instead of getting this one, get some sort of cheap Chinese knockoff inverter. That would be a better use of your money than this, because this is junk, and I need a drink. I feel obligated to do a little addendum here because I was pretty harsh to this inverter, and possibly that wasn't quite warranted. I am disappointed in it, and I would not recommend this inverter to anybody out there. There are better alternatives. But let's try looking at this from a slightly different angle and redoing my conclusion segment. Maybe if we look at this from a slightly different perspective, I'll come to a different conclusion. So let's give that a try. There we go. So if I look at this as a 1500 watt inverter, perhaps I'll draw some different conclusions. So, the Cobra CPI2575 1500 watt modified sine wave inverter. What are my impressions of this, and would I recommend it? Well, there are good and bad things to say about it. It does have a display that shows you the load. That's pretty nice. Not all of them have that. It has 3 outlets, so you can plug in 3 different things without a power strip. They are just in parallel, so you can always just use a power strip, but they do give you 3, and they're decent quality outlets at that, so you can safely plug things in that draw heavy loads and not worry about them overheating. I like that. It has a very novel construction which keeps the cost point down. That can either lead to higher profits or perhaps a lower selling point. Either way, it's a good thing to be more efficient that way. The efficiency of this inverter in terms of input to output conversion efficiency is pretty average. It's in the mid-80s, and that's pretty typical of a low-cost inverter, so I'm not going to knock it for that. It does seem to perform reasonably well for its price point. The load regulation isn't great, but it's adequate, and I can't really say a whole lot bad about it. The case design is pretty compact. It's relatively light because of its all-plastic design, and it seems to function pretty well that way. Should be pretty durable. I actually kind of like this design. I just wish it worked a little bit better. It has 2 fans over here and 1 over here for cooling. The fans are fairly loud, so if noise is an issue, I would not recommend this. And because of its plastic design, if these fans should ever fail for any reason, this inverter will be completely inoperable. I've had inverters before where the fans have failed in it, and they continue to work just fine. They just overheat after a while and then they shut down. After they cool off, they restart. If you put them under a light load, they still work just fine. This one won't do that. This inverter will not work at all if the fans fail. In fact, because the thermal protection is on the input stage and not on the output, if this output fan fails, then you're going to be left with a blown up inverter. So that's one detriment, but overall, it's kind of a novel approach, and I like seeing different things, so that's alright. As far as the input terminals go, I don't especially like these torpedo style lugs. I like to see the ring terminal style. That's just my preference, but otherwise I don't have any complaints about that. In terms of its output performance, it does reasonably well for a 1500 watt inverter. I tested it and it actually does just about 2000 watts, a little less, if you allow for a sizable voltage drop. If you want to keep it around 115 volts, then you're looking at around 1700 watts. And I have a Xantrex 1500 watt inverter that performs very similar to this one. So it's pretty comparable to other good quality 1500 watt inverters out there. It's not too bad that way. It does power my refrigerator, it does not power my air compressor, but you would expect that out of a 1500 watt inverter. So it's also okay that way. In terms of build quality on this inverter, I think they did a pretty good job. If you take a look at the internals of it, which I did in the previous video segments, you'll see that overall the quality is pretty good for a consumer grade inverter. If this is a commercial product, I'd say it's terrible, but it's consumer grade. So yeah, it's acceptable. And overall the quality is better than a lot of others that I've seen, so I can't really complain about that too much. So overall, would I recommend this inverter? Well, I'm tempted to say yes. However, the price point is just too high for a 1500 watt inverter. Now, if this was, say, a 2500 watt inverter, then yeah, it'd be a great deal, but unfortunately it is not. It is a 1500 watt inverter, and there's better options for 1500 watts than the Cobra CPI2575. So I can't recommend this inverter. Thanks for watching.